For me, one of the great moments of American culture actually occurred in August of 1955. Very few people want to talk about it. In 1955, of course, Emmitt Till was murdered by fellow citizens, a victim of U.S. terrorism. His body thrown in the Yazoo River, the Tallahatchie Bridge, under the Tallahatchie Bridge. But his body was brought back to Chicago. And the first major civil rights demonstration took place. 125,000 fellow citizens walked by to take a look at Emmitt Till. His mother left the coffin open so they could see. It's a Pilgrim Baptist Church led by the Reverend Julius Caesar Austin. And he introduced Mom's Till Mabley, and she walked to the lectern. She looked over at her baby, whose head was 5 times the size of his normal head. And she looked in the eyes of America as well as the folk at Southside Chicago. And she said, what? I don't have a minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice for the rest of my life. That's a level of spiritual maturity and moral maturity that does not give up on the Socratic attempt to interrogate the mendacity and hypocrisy of American life, but is rooted in something deep. It's rooted in an attempt to keep track of the humanity of the very people who have dehumanized you. Use that as a standard of responding to terrorism in light of the last 2.5 years. My God, how fascinating. Here's Moms Mabley speaking on her behalf and speaking for the best of the tradition. Martin King's in the background. Fannie Lou Hamer's voice is there. A. Philip Randolph's voice is there. And many nameless and anonymous black leaders who knew they had to deal with a situation in which they were unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who they were. That's what it meant to be a nigger. Unsafe, unprotected, subject to unjustified violence, and hated. Now, after September 11th, all Americans feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. You say, now that the whole nation's been niggerized, let's see what the response is going to be. Interesting. I come from a tradition that says in the face of terrorism, it's justice, not sweet revenge, not short-term retaliation. It's justice. Hunt them down if they've committed a crime, yes. Demonize? No. And even within the black tradition, if there are black folk who demonize, they are criticized based on that tradition in light of their not aspiring to the standards of Emmitt Till's mother. And if that's the case, that's certainly the case for George Bush and other leaders. Crucial, indispensable, bringing together the best of the legacy of Athens, the best of the legacy of Jerusalem, but in the New World context in which legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, police brutality, lynching, discrimination, redlining and bank loans, on and on and on. Always connecting one's vision about one's own freedom to the plight and predicament of others. Sisters of all colors, gay brothers, lesbian sisters, physically challenged brothers, indigenous brothers and sisters, so that they all constitute overlapping and intertwining traditions of struggle. But knowing that the courage to think critically and the courage to love, and I think we need to talk publicly about the courage to love. That's what I love about the best of the black freedom movement. You see, it's very rare that you find progressives. These are my dear white brothers and sisters speaking publicly about love. You say, why is that? Well, it's a longer story we won't go into. Just don't. Abraham Joshua Heschel did. Dorothy Day did. Early Michael Harrington did. The later Michael Harrington, who I worked with very closely, he had shifted from a certain Catholicism to a certain socialism, but was consistent across the board. And he was my comrade in both instances. He just changed his mind on some things. But James Baldwin talked about love explicitly as the most difficult, dangerous, but also the most significant force in the world. Why? Because if you come from a people who have been so hated, love can become subversive and transformative, beginning by loving yourself. Marcus Garvey talked about love explicitly. Yes, Elijah Muhammad didn't talk about loving white brothers and sisters, but that wasn't his only point. There's other people in the world other than white brothers and sisters. Now, he was immature to have to base the love of black people on devaluing white people, but he talked about black people loving themselves. Minister Louis Farrakhan the same way. Much progress and evolution necessary in terms of his building on Elijah in an early stage, yes, but he's talking about loving themselves. Why is that important? Because it's a form of agency. It gives people a sense of confidence. And part of the problem in America is what? People don't feel like they have any agency. They don't feel that they're confident in making a difference at all. And especially in the States, where, my God, what was it in the election, the last election? 80% of white America thought the election was fair, and 80% of black America thought it was unfair. And somebody's right and wrong about this thing. I'm not a relativist at all. There's a fact about the matter. 32% of black people for the war. Nearly 75% is white America for the war. There's a difference here. Agency makes a difference for people who are cutting against the grain in their perceptions. Love becomes a form of agency. And not only that, but it helps break down the barriers, the walls of demarcation. And so even when the black rage and the black fury, the righteous indignation of having to look white supremacy in the face in all of its dimensions and still persists, the language of love still allows white brothers and sisters to recognize that it's not all of them, or it's not genetic. The white brothers and sisters can make choices. John Brown is part of the movement. Tom Hayden's part of the movement, because it's all about choices, decisions, commitments. No one is locked into a pigeonhole or some category. So the love becomes crucial. And not only that, but of course I believe that it's impossible to talk seriously about fundamentally transforming America or any other country, but especially America. It's impossible to do that without talking about forms of spirituality, and especially music. Spirituality is all about how do you deal with your constraints and limitations. And when you run up against that anange, those constraints and limitations, you're going to need something to fall back on, like a community that is sustained by levels of spirituality which have to do with contesting, which have to do with sharing, which have to do with sustaining persons so that they don't become short-term freedom fighters. Miles Horton, that great freedom fighter, 20th century, the white brother who founded Highlander Center, where Rosa Parks and Stokely Carmichael and a host of other freedom fighters would come out of Tennessee and move down to the South. He wrote a wonderful autobiography called The Long Haul. We need freedom fighters like Amy Goodman who are in it for the long haul. And that's hard to do. I know a lot of brothers and sisters from New York and Boston who made it out to Santa Fe trying to get a little distance from urban context. I can understand that. But you bring that tradition with you, because even in Santa Fe, the same struggles go on. Context a little different, bluer sky, okay. More beautiful mountains, yes, okay, I grant you that. No doubt. But you are the same moral, spiritual, politically committed human being here that you were in New York, in D.C., Philadelphia, Chicago, wherever else you come and meet those who have been here for a long time. Brown brothers and sisters. Go back generation after generation after generation. Of course, our indigenous brothers and sisters, century after century after century.